We acknowledged throughout our service this morning that it's a heavy Sunday, even as we celebrate 250 years of the existence of the United States of America. We also carry the heavy memory of 366 days ago when a river of life in Central Texas suddenly became a vehicle of death for so many. 139 lives, we estimate, were lost on July 4th, 2025, including 27 people at Camp Mystic, including one of our very own members, Kellyanne Elizabeth Lytle. And so on a weekend where we have a momentous occasion like a quarter of a millennium to celebrate the existence of the United States, it can be tempting to forget all about what happened just a year ago, to be caught up in the fireworks and the celebrations. And all of that is right and good as a people who celebrate freedom and who make space for each other, who share dreams of what this world could be and how our country might be part of that work. We also acknowledge and we grieve that the reality of the world is far different from our dreams, that people still die tragically at far too young an age, or who die far before their time, and that we can feel powerless in the face of such circumstances. And so we read this story from Genesis 23 to remind us as a people of faith that when it feels like the world wants to move on and go to the next thing, to celebrate and to be full of joy, we also are called to make space for those who are still bogged down and paralyzed even by grief, who are laid heavy with sorrow. And we're reminded in the words of the Apostle Paul that we as a people called Christians are to weep with those who weep. And so we come to this story in Genesis 23, and we've been in Genesis the past few weeks with the liturgical calendar, this story of following Abraham and Sarah through all the many trying circumstances. And you heard a couple of weeks ago about Abraham sending Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness to die. And then last week we heard of Isaac's near sacrifice at the hands of his father, who thinks he's doing the faithful thing, but is truly being tested to see whether he is in deep, vulnerable relationship with the God of life and not of death. And right after this story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, we get this story of Sarah's death. What might shock you is that this is the first time in the book of Genesis, and therefore the first time in the story of Scripture, this is the first time that the word mourn is used. This is the first time that grieving appears. And it might shock you as you spend a minute reflecting on all that has come before chapter 23 in the book of Genesis, all the events and the scale and nature of death that has ravaged God's creation. From interpersonal murders between Cain and his brother Abel, to widespread disasters at the hands of God in the flooding of the world, save Noah, to wars between kings in the Near East in which Abraham and his nephew Lot get caught up, to the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah as fire and brimstone rain down from the heavens. All kinds of death on every scale have occurred in the first 22 chapters, but it's only here in Genesis 23 when Sarah, the matriarch, dies that grief occurs, that the process of mourning happens. One of my guiding lights in theology, the bishop and theologian Chris E.W. Green, notes that we as a people must learn how to sorrow. That pain comes naturally in life, but mourning is holy. And it requires wisdom and courage. After all, Jesus begins the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 with the words, "Blessed are those who mourn." That when we engage in the act of grieving, we are not being unfaithful. We are rather creating a space, acknowledging an empty space in our lives, where perhaps someone or something used to dwell. But in that vast space, the presence of God can be experienced in an intimate and powerful way. That even as we look through tears, we might be able to catch a glimpse of something we could not see with dry eyes. And so 366 days later, we're called to pause and to remember, to grieve, and to make space for those who have felt the pain of loss, not just through these floods, but the pain of loss at any point in their lives, who still feel the twinge of sorrow in their bones. We as a people are called to hold space with them. What do we learn from Abraham in these few short verses from Genesis 23? First, that he does take time to grieve. Unlike those who came before him in the story, Abraham pauses. He doesn't suppress or shortcut or avoid these strong feelings of heartache and sorrow. Instead, it says he went in to grieve and mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And the word grieve here in Hebrew, safad, is not like this polite put together sense of feeling sad, where you can still show up in church with your best dress on or your hair done. No, rather, the Hebrew evokes sentiments of pulling at your hair, of beating your breast, of letting it all out in a primal kind of way, letting the agony exist and feeling it for what it is. That Abraham and Sarah have been on a journey together, that the love between them has grown and deepened and been tried by fire and all kinds of circumstance, and now that love has no person to go to when it goes from Abraham's soul. And he acknowledges that. He doesn't feel unfaithful as he pauses to weep. Rather, he lives in the tension between the God who promises, the God who is life, and the reality of death and loss. Abraham does take time to pause, which is a reminder for us when we live in a world that is so uncomfortable with grief, when we want to move past these feelings that are suspect, or perhaps we don't know how to talk to people in our lives who are grieving. Abraham's example reminds us that we don't need to say much. We don't need to try and fix. But instead, together, we can face the reality with those who are carrying loss and be present to them. I know that in the past year, and I've thought about and prayed for many times the people who experienced loss through these floods, but all too often I allowed this sense of polite distance to overcome me, that I thought about reaching out to people and then I didn't because I thought too many people are reaching out to them, or maybe they don't want to be reminded of what has happened in their lives, or perhaps I don't want to be the straw that broke the camel's back and they're reset again back to square one. But then I recall that oftentimes this polite distance we give to people who are experiencing loss feels like rejection or being forgotten. So if you're feeling grief, or perhaps someone in your life is grieving, the appropriate, faithful thing to do is to acknowledge that, to call it out, to direct your thoughts and your words toward those who are suffering, and to remind them that they are not alone. Because when we reach out, we are nothing less than the presence of God illuminating a dark time in which they are living. But what's fascinating to me in this story from Abraham is that not only does he take time to mourn and to weep, but then in the very next sentence it says, Abraham rose up from beside his dead and immediately goes to the people who dwell in the promised land at this point in the story, the Hittites. And Abraham gets to work. He starts getting busy with activity. And if you were to read the full story from Genesis 23, what you'd see is Abraham entering into a kind of bargaining with the Hittites, trying to acquire a piece of property from those who reside in the land, a permanent place that can belong to Abraham. And then in the very next chapter, after Abraham has buried Sarah, he goes to work looking for a wife for his son, Isaac. Rabbi Sacks, who's one of the great thinkers of Judaism in recent history, talks about how both of these actions, the procurement of property as well as the search for Isaac's wife, both of these are actions taken in reaction to the covenant that God has made just some chapters earlier. You remember the story, right? that God calls Abraham to go to a place that God will show him. And then along the way, God makes promises, enters into a special kind of relationship where God says, if you will be my people, I will give to you many descendants and a land in which you will dwell. And through your family, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, at this point in the story, in Genesis 23, with all that Abraham and Sarah have gone through, the only thing they have to show for all their trials, all their experiences, all their heartache, the only thing is Isaac, who was born to Sarah in an old age, and Ishmael, who came by way of Abraham's slave girl, Hagar. Now, the birth of these children is quite miraculous, but that's it. It's as far as it goes, which in the grand scheme of things isn't very much. Perhaps Abraham is anxious about whether God's promises really will come to pass. Isaac, who's getting older in years and is still single, will he have children? Will his family continue to be foreigners and aliens wandering in a land that is not their own? Abraham gets to work. Even as he grieves, he acts. Which means that Abraham's grief doesn't paralyze him. It propels him into the future. It makes the world a different place because of what he's been through. Abraham is determined to make sure that others are blessed. He's going to live out the covenant promises, even if he's not seeing it in the present moment. He's going to continue to be faithful, trusting that God ultimately will come through. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs notes that it's only as we build a future can we appropriately and properly mourn the past. That if we keep looking backward, if we stay stuck in the past, the future that God intends for all of us will not come to pass. But if we allow our experiences of pain and our processing of the sorrow that comes with that pain, if we allow those experiences to take root in us, we can be a different kind of people for the sake of others in our community and beyond. That God won't waste this horrible, terrible experience that God did not cause. God will work even in the midst of floods and darkness and death to bring forth light and life and hope. But we must act. We must live differently. We must commit to being the covenant people with God, even when tragedy befalls us. That God has not abandoned us, but is continuing to work in our midst. Kellyanne Elizabeth Lytle died on July 4th, 2025 in the Guadalupe River. And since that day, her family, though they are heavy with sorrow and their worlds have been shattered, her family has not failed to continue to live in such a way that honors Kellyanne's life, that lives out her legacy, and brings change to those who continue to suffer in this world. Kindness for Kellyanne is the foundation that the Lytle family established when the money came pouring in from the world around us. And this money was put to good use in the past year, blessing women and children who are in vulnerable situations without shelter, without safety. That money went to benefit causes that protect women and children, giving them a chance at life. It's gone forth to bless the systems and schools of education around our community, creating a space for children to play and have fun and learn and have hope in their future as they go back to school. It's continued to bless families even beyond the borders of the United States, helping somebody in Belize who needed a life-changing operation. They sent money there to give them a shot at life. It doesn't resolve the pain that the Lytles are feeling. It doesn't make everything better. It doesn't bring Kellyanne back, but that experience of grief has changed them. And they act in hope and determination as people who live in the promises of God, trusting that death will not be the final word on Kellyanne or any of the Lytle family or any of you. Abraham can act in ways that are hopeful even amidst his loss because he trusts that God will come through. And we as a people in the church can continue to act thousands of years later in hope that God will come through because we worship a God who has overcome all things, including death. That in the story of our faith and in the person of Jesus Christ, we see nothing being able to separate us from the God who is life. That even when tragedy befalls us, even when we encounter death, what we experience when we enter death is not the end, but there we meet Christ, who is our friend. And as a people of faith who remain on this side of the living, we can continue to commit ourselves to live in ways that bring life to our world, that speak hope into despair, that shine light in the darkness, that bring kindness in ways that love big, and all the things that the 139 lives that are lost continue to believe in. And that begins right here and right now. As we come forward to receive the sacrament of communion, we trust that even though we might come forward with empty hands, that God will give us what we need. Not just bread and juice, but God will give us hope and life, peace and strength and courage in order to be the people of the covenant, that through us, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. That as we eat and we drink, as we come forward and go out, we are doing so on behalf of a hurting world that desperately needs good news. People in Kerr County, people in Central Texas, people in the United States of America, people across the world. We worship, we feast, we live in hope for their sakes and not just for our own. That the promise that Abraham received from God still rings true for us. That through us, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so even as we experience tragedy, and we take time to recognize and appropriately grieve it, even as we go out in the world and continue to act in hopeful ways that we may not see the impact immediately, but planting seeds rather, trusting that God will bear great fruit as we go forth, we hope that God comes through. We trust that God will come through. And we look for the light that cannot be overcome, even as we face the darkness. Amen. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.